Let's talk about his resolutions. I have one specifically I pointed out because when I read it, I was like, wow, that is really odd. So, resolution 38. Do you know the one I'm talking about? If I say resolution 38, can you recall that?
No, I don't have them memorized. You'll have to read that one
Okay,
for
okay, okay. All right. Neither do I. I've got it written on my computer monitor here, so I'm kind of cheating a little bit. Resolution 38 is resolve never to speak anything that is ridiculous, sportive, or a matter of laughter on the Lord's day. So we would see that today and be like, what? You can't joke around on the Lord's day? Like you can't say anything funny? What's going on here? So what's happening with this resolution?
Oh, yeah, that's a good one. Well, Edwards was a person that had a very serious personality. He would readily admit that. Of all of the graces that the Lord gave Edwards in terms of his gifting, social graces was not among them. He struggles very much with interrelationships with his parents and other persons within the congregation. Even his own people did not always think of Edwards as being a very warm or soft person. But in Resolution 38, Edwards is thinking on the grave nature of the Lord's Day. And while it does seem strange for us that this young man would write this, and by the way, he's writing here at age 19. He's only 19 years
Wow.
old when he writes the resolutions. He is thinking about the serious nature of the Lord's Day. And if I'm recalling correctly, he actually wrote that on a Sunday, on the Lord's Day itself. And he must have been thinking about something that may have happened at church. Perhaps he, in a rare moment, had an outburst of laughter himself, maybe something that somebody had said, maybe before or after church. But I think more likely Edwards was probably looking on some of his peers with disdain, thinking about the way
Right,
that they
right.
approached the Lord's Day. Edwards was not often pleased with the performance or the attitudes of some of his peers. We see that especially when he's a tutor at Yale. He doesn't think much of some of the underclassmen and the way that they approach divine
Right.
things and holy worship. But what's interesting to us is we think of this as such a strange resolution because
Yeah.
we love to be together, we love to be joyful. But I come from a movement as a Presbyterian where we still try to honor the Lord's Day. We consider ourselves even today to be a Sabbatarian movement, a movement that
Right.
highly regards the Lord's Day and thinks of it as special, set apart, and different from the other days. And so while we might say Edwards went a little too far with saying he's not even going to laugh on the Lord's Day, I'll grant you that. But I do
Yeah.
think the helpful critique to us, again, generations critique each other, is that Edwards would say we modern evangelicals probably have far too little regard
Right.
for the sanctity of the Lord's Day,
Yeah.
and especially the
Yeah.
times in which we meet together to worship our Almighty God. I think Edwards, if I could just go on here for a second, brother,
Yeah. Yeah. Sure.
would think of some of the things that we do in worship as entirely inappropriate for a setting in which God's people gather to worship. Some of the silliness, some of the performativeness, some of the entertainment,
Hmm.
some of the lights, fog machines, and lasers and movie clips, all this kind of stuff that the modern church has incorporated into worship. I think Edwards would absolutely be aghast if he were to see some of the things
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
we consider to be worship today.
Yeah. Like I can't do it either. Right. Just the showiness of a worship service. It's not. It's just not meant to be showy, right? It's a time for us to come together and worship the Lord together, not to display all the church lights and I think in one case we even saw a disco ball or seen a disco ball coming down. Like anyway, the video's not about worship, but it just kind of reminded me. But in thinking about the resolutions and reading through them, you do get that impression that Jonathan Edwards is really kind of stoic. He's really, he doesn't seem to display a lot of emotion, kind of like almost, I don't want to say curtails it, but doesn't have any real emphasis on that at all. Well, you mentioned that he wasn't like very personable, that his relationships was very difficult. What do you think where do you think that came from? Is there anything in his bio maybe that would suggest that or?
Well, yes, certainly there's part of his personality that was just not necessarily inclined towards interpersonal human relationships. And I think that's probably true for all of us to varying degrees. Now, Edwards, though, was what we would think of today as a verifiable genius. There's no question that Edwards's intellect far exceeds all of his peers and most people before or since, at least when it comes to things like theology. But don't forget, too, that Edwards was also a philosopher. He's written some works that are first-rate philosophy. And so Edwards's genius really spreads over a number of areas. And this kind of makes him like some of the other geniuses, like Da Vinci, for instance, who was a painter and an architect and an anatomist, and he had several other skills. Well, so did Edwards. Edwards was a preacher. He was a missionary. He a philosopher and a theologian. So part of it, I think, is just his natural giftedness. There's a sense in which some geniuses have a hard time getting along with other people because, in one sense, they don't have many real peers when it comes to things of the mind. And so very often they have a difficult time sorting that out when it comes to relationships. But I think also Edwards is a product of his time, in that his father, Timothy Edwards, is a very serious Puritan minister himself. And so Edwards was raised to think very deeply and devoutly of the things of the Lord, as well as his own maternal grandfather was Solomon Stoddard, who you have to understand, in those days, there were two primary people that dominated the religious landscape prior to Edwards' own time, one being Solomon Stoddard and the other being the Mathers family, Cotton Mathers, Increase Mathers, Richard Mathers. And so Edwards was just simply raised in that milieu in which he became a very devoted scholar and a very serious thinker, no doubt because of the influences of his father and his grandfather as well.
So during the Great Awakening, there was a specific Bible that had kind of made its way through there, right? That the primary version being the King James Bible. So I, for those who watch my channel, probably know that I'm more of a majority text guy or a Byzantine guy. Not that there's, I don't think the critical text is evil or anything like that. I just think Byzantine's better. No biggie. So my question is what was Jonathan Edwards using? Was he using the King James Version? Did he refer to original languages like the Textus Receptus or the Masoretic text or things of that nature? What was his textual preference?
Well, first, to answer your question, Edwards undoubtedly used the King James Version of the Bible, as did practically all of his peers. By this time in the 1740s, the King James has become the dominant English language version that most people were using. The Geneva Bible, which preceded the King James Version, had a great amount of usage in the earlier colonial period, especially amongst the Pilgrims. But by the time the 1740s rolls around, or Edwards' time, most people are using the King James. I am not aware that he had anything other than a King James version to preach and to teach from. That was the Bible, the translation that he used for practically everything. Whenever Edwards quotes the scriptures, he is using the King James Version. Although I will tell you this, that many of his quotations are more paraphrastic. Edwards had so much scripture committed to memory that sometimes he'll smooth off the corners of his phraseology because he knows it well. In other words, he'll take certain things in shorthand from time to time.
Right.
But as far as what we would think of as modern textual critical debates, I do think this would be anachronistic to take today's debate on these things and to reverse engineer it back to Edwards' time,
right?
Because that debate really comes after him. So he wouldn't be saying things like the Textus Receptus says this, but the critical text is that, because by and large that's going to come after him. Now, that doesn't mean, though, that Edwards won't from time to time comment on the meanings of Greek and Hebrew. He does that quite a bit, although interestingly not so much in his sermons. He will do that more in his Miscellanies and some of his other treatises. But when it comes to his sermons, he doesn't often explain Greek or Hebrew words to his congregation.
Right.
He just preaches the text. But this could be another field of study that somebody could look into. I'm sure that there's more in Edwards on this topic than I've looked into, and perhaps that's a dissertation yet to be written. Edwards on manuscript tradition or something like that.
Right.
I don't get the sense, though, to be honest, that was an area of interest for Edwards. I've read quite a bit of his stuff and have not found much on Edwards talking about various manuscripts. I just don't think that, even given his broad swath of interests, I wouldn't even know where he would be discussing these things. Maybe in some of his miscellanies, perhaps.
Right.
It's not really a topic for him.
Okay, so you mentioned the miscellanies a couple times now. What are they? I'm sure a number of my viewers aren't aware of what the miscellanies are. Could you give us a quick overview of what that is?
Absolutely. So Edwards has, let's just say, two kinds of written material. On one hand, Edwards has a large volume of material that he prepared intentionally to publish, things he wanted people to read. Things that he sent to the printer with the express purpose of publishing broadly so that people could read it. And so we would think of things like his 1746 book, The Religious Affections, or his work on original sin. He is clearly writing to be read, and he is weighing in on a number of important topics in his day. On the other hand, Edwards is somewhat unique in that he has a large volume of material that he wrote not for the sake of publication, and we usually call those his private writings or his private musings. And unique to Jonathan Edwards is a whole series of notebooks that he called his Miscellanies, and these were his own thoughts that he was writing out. It seems like Edwards almost never had a thought that he didn't want to write down at some place. And so he started with the letter A, and he numbered Miscellany A, and then he went all the way to Z, and then he did AA to ZZ, and then he realized this isn't going to work. I got to switch to numbers. And so he started with Miscellany 1, and then he went all the way up to 1400 and something, and altogether wrote about 1500 miscellanies. Some of these are short paragraphs, others are just a line or two, but quite a few of them would be like chapters of books. They're very, very long sections. And what Edwards did with the miscellanies is he would think through a topic, and then later he might use those paragraphs and put them into his published writings or his sermons. But we might think of the miscellanies as like his first draft on any given topic that he's thinking about. Very important Edwardsian material that all Edwards scholars really enjoy working through.
Yeah, so you're kind of getting the mind of Jonathan Edwards in the miscellanies. This is like all his research and all his thinking and all his thoughts. Kind of like when a preacher would make his notes, he would scribble some stuff down. He had such massive notes, he needed a separate book to put it in. So kind of going back a little bit, I want to go back to the resolutions before we finish up here. So of the 70, do you have a favorite resolution?
Well, I like them all, and they all challenge me in one way or another.
It's like asking what your favorite child is.
Whenever my kids ask me which my favorite is, I always say, "You are, don't tell the others." So each of my three kids, they go around with a secret in their heart thinking that they're my favorite child. But no, I like them all. So Edwards wrote 70 resolutions, and what's neat about them is he was only 19 years old when he wrote them. They're one of the earliest things that we have from Jonathan Edwards. We do have some other materials that predate the resolutions, but not much. His famous spider letter he wrote prior to that, but it's one of his first things that he writes as he is actually becoming a preacher. In fact, he's going to have at this period, 1722 to 23, he's going to have kind of three, we'll call them internships. He had first preached in a small church that was experiencing a church split in New York City, interestingly enough. That only lasted for a few months. And then he very briefly took a charge at a church in Bolton, although it's doubtful that he ever really even begun the work. And then he was also a tutor at Yale. So these three things are combined, I call his early pastoral years. And so Edwards at age 19, he sits down to write these guideposts that are going to, he hopes that will set the trajectory for the kind of person that he wants to become. Of course, he's already thinking about his dad as a pastor and Solomon Stoddard, his grandfather, as a pastor. And he very much wants to live into that reputation as a man of ministerial influence. He wants to be somebody that is significant. But even more so, he wants to be somebody who's faithful to the Lord in terms of personal holiness and discipleship. And so he writes these 70 resolutions, which are going to be guideposts for his life. But you asked me which is my favorite, and there's a number that are my favorite. Probably number 6, where he says, resolved to live with all my might while I do live, I think is a powerful one. He also writes in one place, resolve to think about heaven and hell often. He writes in another place, he resolves to think often of the day of his death, even to think back on what he would do in the last hours of his life. I find all of these to be very challenging, and they certainly exhort us to live a godly life, faithful in Christ Jesus, and that's the helpful aspect of the resolutions.
That's great. So you have written a book about the resolutions. Do you have a copy of it there?
No, I don't.
Lol, logistics nightmare trying to get everything around the world right now. I had a pre-order in and I don't even know if it was canceled yet, but it was supposed to come already, but but anyway, I'm going to leave a link in the description below. There is a book that Pastor Matt has written, and he's going to tell us a little bit about that book right now, aren't you, Pastor Matt?
I sure am. Thanks for asking. Worth the price of admission for me to come on the show.
That's right.
So the book is called Holy Living, Jonathan Edwards' 70 Resolutions for Living the Christian Life. And as the name suggests, I go through each one of the 70 resolutions, and I give some devotional application, I give some historical background, and of course, some biblical exhortation as well, as Edwards interacts with the Holy Scriptures on these things. The book is published by Hendrickson, which recently has been acquired by Tyndale, so it should say Hendrickson on the inside, although it may have the Tyndale logo as well. And it was scheduled to come out October 1st, but unfortunately, as you mentioned, it's a bit delayed with all the supply chain issues. It's probably floating out there somewhere in the Pacific, trying to approach a port in California, perhaps. But the good news is that if you're a Kindle reader, then you can already get it on Amazon or, eventually you can get it practically anywhere, but you can get it there now and read the ebook.
Very good. Awesome. And I'm going to probe you just a little bit more because you had mentioned in a Facebook forum, the Everything's Bibles, this was going back a few months now. You had talked about a Jonathan Edwards study Bible. And I think you were just kind of throwing that idea out there. Were you able to get any traction on that?
Nope, I wasn't.
No, not at all.
I did do an official pitch for Thomas Nelson, but they did not take me up on it. Apparently, the interest level is just not quite there. But I'm not entirely given up on the idea because the Smart Study Bible apparently did fairly well. And I do think maybe something that could be focused on the Puritans might eventually adhere one day for a publisher. So if anyone's out there and you're looking to do a project, let's go, man. Let's do it.
Yeah, that'd be really cool to see like a Bible with all the miscellaneous notes or something like by each text that he had. That would be so cool to see.
That'd be really cool.
Yeah. But anyway, thank you so much, Pastor Matt, for coming on my channel and for sharing a little bit about Jonathan Edwards. I really appreciate it, and hope we can do something else some other time.
All right. Thank you so much for having me. It's been great.
All right, Brother Matt, take care. All right, brothers and sisters, that's it from Pastor Matt here. Until next time, we'll see you around.